Most people have heard of Tibet, and many people are familiar, somewhat at least, with the Tibetan cause. And that's due in part to the celebrity status of the Dalai Lama, particularly after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, Hollywood's patronage of the Tibetan cause for a time, and some other factors. But far fewer are familiar with East Turkestan, despite the fact that East Turkestan is about the same size, has a very similar, strikingly similar history, and also claims independence, or at least many East Turkestanis. They have that similar independence claim as the Tibetans, and yet hardly anyone's ever heard of it. Now, if you come to East Turkestan today, or what the Chinese government calls Xinjiang, you'll find lots of different people. You'll find Han Chinese, relatively newly arrived Han Chinese. You'll find Kyrgyz and Kazakhs and Uzbeks and Tajiks and others. But the group that is most represented, besides the newly arrived Han Chinese colonists, the biggest local group are the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs. Culturally, linguistically, and numerically, this is the dominant local group. So who are the Uyghurs? And why don't they have their own country? Lots of police here. Anyway, trying to find a Uyghur homeland, or trying to find some core ancestral group for the Uyghurs, it's tricky business because A, you've got Uyghur nationalists trying to tie Uyghur history back thousands of years in this region. They want to be indigenous. Meanwhile, you've got Chinese government officials doing their utmost to try to convince the Uyghurs that they are Chinese. So that contest between nationalists and Chinese officials, that's muddying the waters a bit. And B, the very term, the very idea of Uyghur has changed over time. Uyghur has a mixed meaning. Not to mention the fact that the idea of a Uyghur nation, I mean, that's a modern concept altogether. So what we can say fairly certainly is that the ancestral sources of today's Uyghurs are twofold. First, you've got the Indo-European speaking peoples who inhabited the oasis towns in the Tarim Basin since ancient times, thousands of years, as one source. And two, you've got the Turkic peoples, the Turkic speaking peoples, who migrated here in the 800s and after the fall of the Uyghur Khaganate in what is today Mongolia. So let's take a look at both. Now, lots of different people have lived in this area, over the past several thousand years. From the ancient Uyghur, who traded in jade. You've got the Tocharians, the Indo-European speaking Tocharians, who set themselves up in oasis towns along the Silk Road. You've got the Shakas. This is a branch of the Scythians. These are Eastern Iranian speaking, and thus also Indo-European. Also in the oasis towns. In fact, Kashgar itself was the capital of a Shaka kingdom back in the day. Sogdians wandered in too. For a while, this area was under the control of the mighty Xiongnu. At other times, it fell under the shadow of various Chinese empires, in particular the Han and the Tang for relatively brief periods. But for most of its history, this region, the people of this region, they didn't identify with any single nation or empire. These are very cosmopolitan people. This is a crossroads, and the people tended to identify more with their own oasis cities. They acted like oasis city-states, basically. So this great mix of people, these are one of the primary ancestral groups of the modern Uyghur. We turn now north and northeast to Mongolia, where in the mid-700s, a massive polity was established, the Uyghur Khaganate. It lasted from the mid-700s to the mid-800s. And of course, the Uyghurs had been around for centuries and centuries before this. But after intense fighting between rival Turkic groups, not to mention the fall of the mighty Gulk Turks, the Uyghur nobility were able to set themselves up as supreme over another great Turkic confederation of tribes. Now, over the next several decades, the Uyghur Khaganate expanded to the north at the expense of the Kyrgyz, to the south at the expense of the floundering Tang. But the Khaganate had too many enemies, in particular the Tibetans, and of course the Kyrgyz and the Tang, all of whom sent armies against the Uyghur Khaganate. And in 847, the last Uyghur Khagan was killed. And after the fall of the Uyghur Khaganate in what is today Mongolia, largely to the Kyrgyz, they were scattered. And different groups of Uyghurs went in different directions. And some of them went to the Tarim Basin. They crossed the Tian Shan and they came here to where I'm standing. This is the ruined city of Qara-hoja. Qara-hoja lasted for 500 years. It's one of the longest lasting, if not the longest lasting, major polity in East Turkestani history, in the history of the Tarim Basin. You'd be hard-pressed to find any other polity of note that lasted as long. We're talking the mid-800s, about 850, this new kingdom is established here in this fortress city. And a new era has dawned in the history of the region. The Uyghur era of history has arrived. They become the dominant political class, and they bring with them, of course, their language, which over time will come to replace the local languages. In typical Silk Road fashion, what the Uyghurs found here was a settled population that was already very mixed. You have people of Han Chinese descent, you have people of Persian descent, other Turkic descended peoples. You've got Manichaeans, you've got Nestorian Christians, and you have Buddhists, and Buddhism was the dominant faith system. So when the Uyghurs showed up, of course, they're going to become the dominant political class, probably numerically superior, militarily superior. They're going to set themselves up and essentially conquer this area. But they're also going to adopt things from the settled population. Most noteworthy of all, probably, Buddhism. Many of them were Manichaean, but most of them will convert to Buddhism. This will become a Buddhist bulwark. You'll see later in the West there will be Turkic kingdoms that will convert to Islam, including some Uyghurs. But in Qara-hoja here, Buddhism will remain, the dominant faith system into the 1400s, and there won't be significant Islamization here until the late 1400s and the early 1500s. In fact, it won't even be complete until the 1600s. So think about that. If you come to East Turkestan today, or Xinjiang, the new frontier, as the Qing called it, you'll find that the Uyghurs are Muslim. And that's, they're known as Muslims. But up until the 1600s, that was not the case. Many of them, and for a while, almost all of them, were actually Buddhists, having adopted the faith system of those who already lived in this area when they arrived from Mongolia. Now this city, why did it last so long compared to other cities? 500 years here at Qara-hoja. Why? Well, the city's lifespan might have been cut short in the 1200s, but its leaders prudently decided to submit voluntarily to Genghis Khan and the Mongols, and it bought them an extra 100 years or so of life. And after Genghis Khan, of course, his empire is going to split between his sons and whatnot. You'll have the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate and the Yuan dynasty. And at first, this area will seem to be under the Yuan dynasty, which administered it as a separate country, which it was, of course. It was not administered as if it was part of China. But later, in the late 1200s, the early 1300s, the Chagatai Khanate will send tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of troops here and take it over years and years of fighting. And all that war, plus perhaps a little climate change, led to the abandonment of the city by the 1300s. By now, the Uyghurs are a mix of their Mongoloid Turkic ancestry, as well as now you've got Caucasian ancestry, so they've mixed with the locals, those who had existed here before. And for the next several centuries, the region will find itself under the rule of several sort of successor polities of the Mongols. So the Chagatai Khanate and others break up. You've got Uyghurstan, and you've got, Kashgaria, and you've got Mughalistan. Eventually, the Dzungar Mongols, the Dzungar Khanate, will come rolling in. This is possibly the last great nomadic empire in world history. And they'll control much of the region for a while and cause enough of a ruckus that the Qing will respond. The Qing Empire, based in China, will respond with armies of its own, and the Qing will roll in. The Qing called East Turkestan Xinjiang, meaning new frontier, new territory. Just a telling detail given the current political situation. But in any case, it took 100 years, or more than 100 years, for the Qing to finally incorporate Xinjiang into the Chinese provincial system. And even then, governors ruled Xinjiang like their own personal kingdoms with little contact with China itself. In 1826, there was a massive revolt here. There were revolts all the time, by the way, in Xinjiang against the Chinese. One of the biggest occurred here in Kashgar, 1826, 10-week siege until the Qing officers in the city all committed suicide and all the soldiers were massacred. The Qing weren't able to regain control for an entire year. Well, revolts continued, especially after the Qing began enacting a policy of immigration, encouraging Han immigration into the region in order to pacify the region. This is something that the current government still does with great success. Okay, so there's revolt after revolt after revolt, scores of rebellions. In the 1860s, things heated up again. And throughout much of the 1870s, most of East Turkestan was being run completely independently of China by a guy named Yaqub Beg. I mean, he's making treaties with Russia and Britain all on his own. The Qing have lost control. Now, for a while, the Qing even considered leaving Xinjiang alone. Now, think about that for a second. That's quite a telling detail in and of itself. But in any case, in the end, the decided upon course was reconquest. And so Qing armies rolled back in, and by 1878, the region had been subdued once again. And once again, that Han immigration was encouraged, and wave after wave of Han migrants moved into East Turkestan. Of course, within 30 years, a little over 30 years of the reconquest, the Qing itself had fallen in China. Now, during the Republic period of China's history, of course, East Turkestan is being ruled nominally by the Republic, but really by warlords. It's essentially being run as its own country by these warlords with very, very nominal connections to the Chinese heartland. And even then, in the 1930s and again in the 1940s, independent East Turkestans are established by the locals. In the 1930s for a few months, and in the 1940s for 5 years, until Mao's troops invaded and took over East Turkestan for China once again. Han migration was immediately encouraged, and today the Han outnumber the local Uyghurs by about 1 million. Of course, this was helped along by an early Uyghur exodus to escape Chinese rule. Speaking of Chinese rule, Chinese Communist Party rule here in East Turkestan has been characterized over the past 65, 70 years by concentration camps, labor camps, public executions, the systematic destruction of Uyghur neighborhoods, and a systematic attack on Islam itself, banning religious organizations, destroying mosques, seizing mosque land, you name it. Meanwhile, the regime has refashioned the history of the region in Chinese Communist Party fashion, just communist fashion, in order to justify the Chinese imperial presence. If that means only highlighting ties with China, well, so be it. And those who dare peddle a different narrative, well, they face house arrest or worse. Now, local resistance groups by the dozen have, gone in and out of existence, but China's grip over the region has only tightened. In fact, come to Kashgar today, and it's your typical Chinese city, unless you're in Old Town, but Old Town is shrinking. And if you want to enter Old Town, every conceivable entrance and exit is manned by police in riot gear, and locals must subject themselves to scanners and pat-downs and ID checks just to move around their own dwindling neighborhoods. Though there are large Uyghur populations in diaspora communities in Central Asian states and in Turkey, with smaller pockets in North America and Europe and Australia, still, no country of their own. No country of their own. And judging by the heavy military and police presence here in Kashgar, not to mention the apparent need of the regime to pepper the city with Chinese flags and propagandistic billboards and posters, it seems it would take much to wrest control of the region away from Beijing. And many of the locals here sort of have a sense of hopelessness in that regard. Still, history would suggest that even this incarnation, the latest incarnation of the Chinese Empire, will retract from Central Asia back to the Chinese heartland. And it just may be that the Uyghurs will get their chance to proclaim a free and independent East Turkestan.